Thank you. All right, great. How's my mic? I tend to sound a bit fuzzy sometimes when I'm talking on these things. So thank you very much for including me. I'm sure that I'm going to be quite a different speaker to what you're used to. I'm not a game designer at all. My background is in psychology, and I do a lot of things on the business side at Ayogo where I hear from clients. For us, those are primarily healthcare clients, about how games and gamification, I know that's a bit of a dirty word, but how games and gamification can make a difference for them in completely non-game settings. So my background is in psychology and business, so a lot of what we could talk about today is the brain and how we're wired for play and learning that way. What I'd like to see from the audience is a vote, whether you are primarily interested in money or whether you're primarily interested in the brain. So I have a business side. I can talk a little bit about how we design for change and what that looks like to a business, or I could talk a little bit longer on the brain. I'm going to cover it all, but I can linger. So who's for money? Who's for the brain? Oh, my kind of people. Awesome. Awesome. All right, so just a little bit of a mnemonic for Ayogo. Actually what we're seeing on the left-hand side is the Temple of Seti in Egypt, and that's the roof, and the priests used to sit on the roof, and if it got a bit cloudy at night when they were trying to look at the stars, they would play a game like Mancala, and that is Ayo, one of the oldest games in the world. And Go, who here plays Go? Awesome! Go, as many of you know, is a binary game. It's got black and white tiles. Some people know it as Othello, a simpler version. And I like it because I often use it as a baseline for people who come to us and say, I want to make something like The Sims, or I want to make something that's this immersive environment that people can play for about 45 minutes. And we say, well, you know what? Pixels also work. You can flip them back and forth and create very, very complex strategy games. And Go is, I believe, the only strategy game that has not, as far as I know, been beaten by a computer. It is, human strategy is smarter than the computer still. That's me in the corner. My name's Mavis Dixon, and I'm with Ayogo. So Michael Ferguson, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us, he's the CEO for Ayogo, and I both like to start our talk with this picture. We like to talk about one of the most universal games in the world, hide and seek. It's a completely emergent game that has doesn't even need to be taught, really. Most people have a version of hide and seek that they learned as a child. And the reason why we play this game is because it has helped our society, our humans, to survive. We've learned how to avoid predators. We've learned how to be a predator. We've learned how to study the behavior of others. We've learned a lot of things about how to get along in a safe and playful space. And this is really important because you don't learn things in production. For example, there's a great reason why we learn these things through safe and playful spaces. It's so that we gain the skills when our adrenaline is low, and when the stakes are high, we're in a position where we can draw on that learning. So the bridge from play to games is that games take that emotional reaction that we have, where we're curious and we're alert and we're learning about how things come together, and they formalize them. So games add structure, basically, to that experience of play, and they do so by adding a win state, and rules, a feedback system. And the last point's often forgotten when we talk about games, particularly when I talk to clients about games, is this idea of voluntary participation. I love this photo because I could use the game golf or anything, because it really it's a great example of the unnecessary obstacles that Bernard Suits talks about. We find things that have all of these unnecessary steps if we're voluntarily engaging with them. Woo! Woo! Sorry. I know you guys are fast. Wow, holy mackerel. Okay, so, I love this game. I love golf because they involve tricky things, small pucks, small balls, sticks, confined spaces. That intensifies the experience of play. It intensifies this wired experience we have of fun. And again, in Bernard Suit's definition of a game, there's a key word in there again, which is a voluntary. So if you actually have somewhere to go and places to go, people to see, you really don't want to do the unnecessary, difficult steps. You want to cut right to the chase. But if you're actually in the experience in a playful space, it's all those little extra steps that actually build engagement. So for a lot of our clients, we talk about designing this experience of engagement because they have problems. So in the healthcare space, people know what's wrong, they know what they're supposed to do, they start off passionately agreeing to do something, and then they drop off, and they disengage from their treatment. And so a lot of the applications that we design are about building engagement over time. How does somebody with a chronic condition like diabetes stay with the game plan of doing constant blood work and multiple medications and exercise and lifestyle things? It's a daily grind, and it's not much fun. So we have applications that we've designed for that, and the reason why video games are a particularly interesting application to healthcare is because of all of the tricks that they have refined. And the reason why video games can tell us what will work is because of all of the analytics and telemetry that has gone into looking at when people drop off. What is disengaging and what is motivating? And they've made a fine science of it. So we can actually take all the bells and whistles from games and put them into healthcare applications, which typically look incredibly boring. So this is probably fairly well-known engagement loop. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. The stimulus may come in. If you feel compelled by that stimulus, you become alert to it, and you take an action, and then you get feedback, well, was I successful in that action or not? And if I was, then I may actually be more responsive next time to that stimulus. Dopamine starts off as something that anticipates the feedback and reward, and is associated with that. And over time, you can form habits using this loop. So I mentioned earlier on, or the first slide talked about persuasive technology. The loudest voice, or the most prominent voice in this space, is somebody called BJ Fogg. Anybody heard of him? Wow, that's amazing. He's so, in the quantified self space and in a certain aspect of healthcare app building, he's kind of like the guy. So that's good, this will be new to you. So the idea, BJ Fogg had this idea that you could design online experiences using this habit loop, this dopamine loop, and you have something called the activation threshold. So a trigger is, if it's too weak, you will not cross the activation threshold and act. If you have a difficult thing to do, you have to have an incredibly strong trigger and a promise of, I should get rid of that, a promise of a significant reward for you to feel motivated enough to cross that activation threshold. That's basically what that line means, that it's things that are easy to do, you don't need to give much motivation to cross that threshold. So the triggers have to be very, very designed for the behavior. If you know that the behavior is going to be very difficult, you need to have a strong motivator. So he has actually a really interesting grid about what he defines as simple, and there's a whole pile of things that go into that, and I suggest you Google it, but they include things like financially difficult, physically difficult, mentally difficult, time is difficult, and that everybody has, there's 6 measures, I can't remember them all right now, but everybody has a different thing that is difficult. So somebody who's rich might have no time, so for them, time is the difficult. For other people, may have lots of time, but no money. So anyway, it's just interesting design thinking. I suggest you look them up. So one of the things that I like about this diagram is that it does tie into a lot of the big thinkers around motivation. So Csikszentmihalyi, Czech researcher, I'll talk a little bit about. He's very good about the talking about things that create a sense of flow. They tend to be up in that high motivation and hard to do space. When something becomes habituated, so you've done it a lot of times, it's no longer hard to do, then it can fall into the habit space. And B.J. Fogg is big about designing little habits. So we tend to be working in this space here. So we're not really in the flow space. And some of you who are working on AAA games, you often probably get to that level of intensity where you're really in flow. But really what we're trying to do is break down difficult things into small, small steps that are easy to do, easily triggered, and easily habituated. So we're not making AAA games. I don't know if I have time to linger on this page, but I like to talk about it because I'm not a gamer. I'm a musician in the background, and I love the Goldberg variations, and I like to talk about them as an analogous connection, which is, somebody mentioned the boss fights earlier. Goldberg variations are kind of like a boss fight. They start off relatively easy, and then you can get, more and more intense, and it becomes very engrossing. And those are the kinds of experiences that can lead to flow. So anyway, I like to think about flow. It's one of my favorite topics. I just don't usually talk about it in game space. Has anybody here heard of Nicole Lazzaro? Okay, good. A couple people. Great. So this is now where we're moving from sort of the appearance of fun and engagement to what's actually going on in our brains. So DOSE is her acronym for dopamine. I mentioned dopamine as very key to our attention. We often have autopilot running. Dopamine is what jolts us out to notice when we're driving, the drive that we drive every day, that somebody's standing at the side of the road. Oh, attention. That's a little hit of dopamine. Dopamine is things that respond to those triggers. So you're having a routine experience out of which some new bit of information is making you pay attention and figure it out. And games, of course, are very, very full of this. Particularly when you're learning a new game, you're learning a new behavior, you have a lot of attention focused on getting it right. It's effortful. It's an effortful time for your brain. But what we often see with applications is sort of a hockey stick where people start off quite engaged in that dopamine stage. They're firing like crazy, very motivated to learn, very excited about it, but then it declines quickly. So there are other things that will keep it going. Boss fights, of course, keeping the steady increases of challenge. But another thing that can really keep engagement going is oxytocin. So oxytocin is a neuropeptide. It's made up of, I think, 6 different amino acids or something like that, produced in your pituitary gland. And it basically, some people think of it as the cuddle hormone, love hormone, but that's wrong, actually, because you can trigger oxytocin by shooting guns. You can trigger oxytocin by having high adventures. It's actually a morality drug. There's a really good TED Talk by Dr. Zach about oxytocin. It's about the us and them. So there's the social bonding that is the love drug part of it, but there's also the stay away from me, you're on that side part of oxytocin. So we know a lot about oxytocin and the role of bonding mother and baby. It's a very strong chemical part of that process associated with breastfeeding, but it's also very triggered by social experiences. So checking Facebook. Dr. Zach did a whole bunch of studies about real-life environments in which oxytocin was flooding our systems. And checking Facebook was super powerful for some people, but not at all for others. For a lot of people, physical touch, of course, is a good one. Nicole Lazaro has a good example of how the touchscreen experience is very caressing. Like she says, you think about the stroking and pinching and all of these things that we do to our phone. If somebody did them on the back of your hand, you'd better be on a date. And so there's a lot of things that are kind of interesting about oxytocin. It is easy to test in that its baseline is 0 in your brain and blood level and your blood work, but it's easy to trigger. So Dr. Zach has done all sorts of real-life experiments about measuring the level of oxytocin in weddings, testing all the guests and the bride and the groom, and like I said, shooting and all sorts of things. So he's an interesting guy. And it's huge in video games. It's one of the sustaining neuro experiences. So dopamine is something that tends to be important in the onboarding experience, those really expensive first few minutes of play. Oxytocin is your League of Legends team, you know, that they trust that you're going to stick around, you're not going to jam out on them. Oxytocin is also known as the trustworthy drug. So about 5%, and lots of really interesting experimental examples of how you can test trustworthy around money and so on. But oxytocin is it doesn't have the altruistic and social and trustworthy benefits in about 5% of the population. Dr. Zach refers to them by the highly scientific term of bastards in his studies. But for the other 95% of us, it's very predictable what will stimulate it, and it is pervasive in our interactions with video games. Also, I'm sorry to linger on it, but one of the things in our applications that we found very, very interesting was Ayogo created the first in the market healthcare game for adults with type 2 diabetes. And so we did a lot of analysis after the fact of how people were interacting and how that translated into behaviors. And what we saw was that the size of your social graph, how many people you know on your game, was not a really big deal. But the number of incoming messages you got related to a behavior change activity was a big deal. So if you were receiving likes, comments, challenges, you were 3 times more likely to commit to carrying out a healthy behavior than somebody who was sending those messages and not getting them back. So we often think of Facebook as sort of a broadcast tool, that we love Facebook because we can tell everybody what we're doing. And I want you to just take a second and think about your own experience with some of these social media spaces. So I use Facebook. I put some of my most heartfelt things on Facebook. But the things that I remember and will value retroactively are the ones that people liked and commented on. And the things that I thought were most important to me rearrange in order based on what I got back from people. So a big part of that is oxytocin. Okay, serotonin, it is mostly produced in your gut. It's a product of tryptophan, which is a food-based product. Serotonin is, there's some early research being done on whether you can develop a serotonin resistance, like you can develop insulin resistance, that if you live in too stimulating an environment, that you actually get resistant serotonin, and that's one theory behind the pervasiveness of depression right now. So serotonin is something where if you have high levels of serotonin, you tend to be a happier person. If you have depressed levels of serotonin, you tend to be depressed. So serotonin is interesting. It's very much associated with positive mood. And there's lots of interesting research around serotonin and depression. It's something that can be boosted by exercise, proper diet, but also things like stimulation. And endorphins, that's a contraction of endogenous morphines. So your endorphins are your opiates. That's your system that gives you a sense of reward when you've done something. Oh my goodness, time's flying. All right, so I will throw this slide up just because we have a lot of UX designers, and we often have people who think a good design is the simplest path. Anybody play Magic? This is a spellcasting chart. So sometimes this is the right answer. Sometimes this is the right answer. So really, there has to be a bit of a thought process before you decide whether a game can be used to change real-life behaviors on when it makes sense. So going back to that earlier comment about what's voluntary, you know, if you really need to do your banking, rescue the princess, right? If you want to have somebody commit an experience and come back again and again to a space, you need to have the engagement complexity of a game. So I ask our clients to think through the answers to these questions. Are they asking people to do something in a time-constrained part of their day? Is there something specific that we can get them to focus on rather than, you know, a whole package? Is there some small change element that we can focus on? Is there something where it's scary for them? So you can imagine newly diagnosed people often have a very high fear level around what they have to do. So games can be a space where they can experiment with some of these new behaviors and look at outcomes. Rote learning can be very effective in some spaces, but games are good ones for the ones where it doesn't work. So I think I'll skip over these a little bit. This is something where, this is actually how it looks if you look at it online, and I would suggest that you go and do that. You can download this. This is Nicole Lazzaro's 4 Keys to Fun. But simplified, she says that good game design should have all of these 4 elements mixed up. And she does tie it back to dose. So this is related to, people find as oxytocin. The Fiero and release is very much endorphins and dopamine. Serious fun is that sense of progress that we have through a lot of our applications. Yeah, spend some time looking at it online. That's a little too complicated to talk about. Okay, so how does this work when Ayogo gets involved? So I think Aaron had mentioned narrative yesterday, and I hear storytelling a lot in our discussions right now. So the narrative is a very well understood part of games now. I think particularly when we're helping people assimilate knowledge around an illness, narratives can be super helpful. I'm not the first person to experience this. They've succeeded at managing this. I'm chasing them. But progressive mastery is really how we differentiate ourselves from a lot of the application developers that are making games in the healthcare space. Many of them in the quantified self space get that. I don't know if anybody else is wearing a Fitbit, but there's a lot of feedback that you can get in the quantified self space. But to make it meaningful is what we do well at Ayogo. And we have the opportunity to mix this idea of progress and narrative in one of our applications that we just developed for Kaiser Permanente in the United States for people who are preparing for bariatric surgery. They have to complete 12 weeks of behavior change, and they have this cognitive behavioral therapy approach to goal setting and motivating themselves. But then they also have to get this sense that they are able to live with the decisions that they're making when they have the surgery. So in that game, the rewards are actually these unlocking narratives. They're choose-your-own-adventure type mini-narratives where 6 different characters are at different stages at dealing with bariatric surgery, some pre-surgery, some post-surgery, and the complex decisions that they have to make every day. Very, very satisfying results came back from our evaluation on that, and we saw with the control group where there was just the biometrics alone, and ours where they had biometric integration with the game, plus everybody had this coaching thing going on, they lost twice as much weight and did twice as many healthy behaviors using the game application. And the feedback was that the narratives were super important and helpful to them. Social. So when I talked a little bit about the hockey stick curve for dopamine, you often see that game experience. A lot of people will have a great time with the game and then they're done. Social, on the other hand, builds the engagement over time. So the more social features you can build into a game, the more you can alleviate that negative curve. So you want to have both. So you're keeping people building in one space while their engagement hits decline. Okay, I think I'm probably getting close to my time, so maybe I'll stop it there. And any questions? Maybe I can save the last few minutes for questions. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I can do, yes, and I am. I also run the LinkedIn patient engagement group. I think it's called Patient Engagement. So my name's Mavis Dixon, and my email's mavis@ayogo. So I can get part of this up on SlideShare, and yeah, sure. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
So if a game helps someone learn a new behavior that's positive, are they dependent on that game, or can they continue that good behavior after they stop playing?
Now, learning and doing, 2 different things. So what we've seen is that people can know a lot. They can learn and be educated a lot about a problem, and it will have 0 impact on their behavior change. So you have to think differently about actually behavior change. So the social, I mentioned, is extremely powerful in getting people to engage with real life changes. Some of the biggest health games, serious games that were very educational, I mentioned one where you journey through the inside of your body and so on. People loved the games, they learned tons, but they had 0 impact on their change of behavior. So the evolution towards integrating biometric feedback, so things like Fitbits and so on, other measures too, plus the social, plus the narrative, seem to actually be much more impactful in making these tiny little behavior changes over time. So something to think about if you're going to get into the healthcare space is that they're actually going to be measuring their ROI based on a change. So don't make the mistake that many companies do of building an educational game, because it doesn't, unless the metric is education and knowledge, it really doesn't translate into behavior change. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, sure. So the Ayogo process is a user-centered design process. So we use design thinking as an early stage where we understand the user as much as possible. And then usually so if you picture a Venn diagram, there's a whole bunch of things that we fill up on the user side of it. And then there's a whole bunch of things that we fill up on the client side of it. And we try and find what it is that are those discrete behaviors that are actually going to translate into ROI. So that's core to the design thinking process. Then we try and figure out who's going to distribute this thing. So there's zillions of health apps out there. I don't know, 22,000 or something like that. And very few of them are being used. I think about 15% of them have the vast majority of the distribution. So in our experience, the Ayogo model is to partner with a community group that's already present online. So in the case of this healthcare game for Boehringer Ingelheim, we actually created it in partnership with the Diabetes Hands Foundation. They already had 22,000 people who were in their social space. So you got to think about that when you're promising a deliverable. We don't really want to respond to RFPs where they say, we'll do the game, we'll do the design, we'll do the this and that, and we'll do the distribution, and we'll reach a distribution metric of X. If they have a marketing budget, yeah, okay, we might commit to that. But if they don't, there's a lot of regulatory constraints around what they can do to promote a game. And so if they are willing to partner with a nonprofit and have the game be branded under that nonprofit, then there's usually a distribution model that'll work. If they aren't willing to do that, don't get in bed with anybody who asks you to do the distribution. It's not going to work. My name is Mavis Dixon, and I'm Mavis at ayogo.com, Mavis-Dixon. And Mavis is Mavis at Ayogo. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.